Long before Jerusalem became a religious and political center of global importance, the first human settlements existed in the area of today's Old City, dating back to around 3000 BC. This early period still falls deep within the Bronze Age, an era when life in the hills of Canaan was primarily shaped by small farming communities and village structures. The area that would later become world-renowned as Jerusalem offered several decisive advantages due to its geographical location. It lay on a ridge, protected by natural valleys, and nearby sprang the Gihon Spring, one of the few permanent water sources in the region. In an otherwise often dry and impassable environment, this was a crucial factor for the emergence of a permanent settlement. Although archaeological finds from this period are sparse, they indicate that people settled on the narrow ridge, where the so-called City of David later emerged over 5,000 years ago. Found pottery shards, remnants of walls, and traces of simple dwellings show that a small but continuously inhabited community existed here. It can be assumed that these early inhabitants practiced agriculture, kept simple animals, and due to their location amidst trade routes, were also in contact with neighboring communities. The place was too small to be considered a city in the true sense. Yet its strategic location made it a potential core for later developments. It is noteworthy that Jerusalem may have already held a certain special status in this early phase. Many other places in Canaan were concentrated either on coastal regions or fertile plains, but Jerusalem lay off these main centers on difficult terrain in the Judean mountains. Precisely this seclusion might have protected the place in early times from major destructions that befell many other settlements during the turmoil of trade conflicts and migratory movements. Instead, a small, stable settlement core developed here, gradually solidifying. It is astonishing that from these modest beginnings, a city later emerged that not only attracted kingdoms and empires, but continues to embody religious aspirations, political claims, and historical ruptures to this day. The origin of this development lies in the inconspicuous beginnings of the early Bronze Age, when people on a slope near a spring began to build the first houses, lay out fields, and lay the foundation for one of the most historically rich cities in the world, Canaanite City. In the second millennium BC, the small settlement began to develop into a fortified city-state, appearing in sources under the name Jerusalem or Jerusalem. This name is remarkable because it likely means City of Peace or City of the god Shalem. Shalem was a Canaanite deity associated with dusk and possibly with peace. Already here it is evident that Jerusalem possessed not only a geographical but also a religious significance early on. The inhabitants of this period were Canaanites, later also called Jebusites, who, like many city-states in the region, were in constant exchange but also in conflict with neighboring cities. Archaeological finds indicate that Jerusalem was fortified with walls and simple defensive structures. Thus, it belonged to the smaller but strategically important cities of the Canaanite cultural sphere. Access to water through the Gihon Spring remained the heart of the settlement, and complex tunnel systems or shaft constructions discovered later may have originated in this epoch. From Egyptian texts, the so-called Amarna letters from the 14th century BC, we know that the city prince of Jerusalem was a vassal of the pharaoh. These letters, preserved on clay tablets in cuneiform script, provide a unique insight into the political conditions of that time. They show that Jerusalem was not isolated but part of a widespread system of power, diplomacy, and dependence. The Prince of Jerusalem reported to the Egyptian king about uprisings in the surroundings and requested military support. This indicates that the region was already characterized by constant conflicts at that time. The religious dimension also played a role in this phase. Jerusalem was not an economic center like the cities on the coast, but it evidently possessed a cultic significance. The connection to the god Shalem and its location on a ridge might have ensured that the place was used for sacrifices and rituals. Some researchers see this as an early indication of Jerusalem's later religious centrality. At the time of the Jebusites, i.e., in the 11th and early 10th centuries BC, the city was a small but fortified center of power in the Judean mountains. It was difficult to access and thus militarily hard to conquer, a circumstance that would further shape its history. From the Canaanite city of Jerusalem developed that fortified place which the Israelites under King David finally captured and made their capital. But before this happened, Jerusalem was for many centuries one of those typical Canaanite city foundations, small, defensible, religiously significant, and embedded in the complicated network of regional power struggles. Conquest by David. Around the year 1000 BC, one of the most decisive turning points in the history of Jerusalem occurred, its conquest by King David. According to biblical tradition, Jerusalem at this time was still a Jebusite city, a fortified place on a hill that seemed almost impregnable due to its walls and difficult access. The Jebusites allegedly scoffed that even the blind and the lame could defend the city. But David succeeded in taking this bastion. There are different traditions regarding the exact procedure. Some sources report an attack via an underground access, possibly through the so-called Warren's shaft, which channeled the water of the Gihon spring into the city's interior. Others point to a siege. What is certain is that the capture of Jerusalem was a strategic and symbolic act of the greatest importance. David, who had previously been king of Judah in Hebron, recognized that Jerusalem offered ideal conditions as a capital. Firstly, the city was geographically favorably located between the northern and southern tribes of Israel, i.e., in the border area between Judah and Benjamin. This allowed it to serve as a neutral place that favored none of the tribal groups. Secondly, the city had no direct affiliation with any of the tribes of Israel as it had been controlled by the Jebusites until then. By making it his capital, David created a new political and religious center that could symbolically unite all the tribes. Jerusalem thus received a dual function. It became David's royal residence and at the same time the religious center of the emerging Israelite kingdom. To consolidate this role, David brought the Ark of the Covenant, which represented the visible sign of God's presence for the Israelites, to Jerusalem. With this act, he endowed the city with an outstanding spiritual significance that continues to this day. Jerusalem was thus no longer just a strategic location, but became a symbol of the covenant between God and his people. The conquest of Jerusalem by David marked the beginning of a new phase in the history of Israel. From a small, locally significant Jebusite city-state, it became the capital of an expanding kingdom. This step also laid the foundation for subsequent developments under David's son Solomon, who had the temple built, thereby definitively manifesting Jerusalem's religious centrality. In many respects, it was David's decision to choose Jerusalem as his capital that singled out the city from the multitude of Canaanite cities and set it on the path to becoming one of the most important cities in world history. Solomon's Temple. With Solomon, the son and successor of King David, the young Israelite kingdom reached a golden age that resonates in collective memory to this day. Around 950 BC, Solomon had a structure built in Jerusalem that would become the central institution of the Jewish faith, the First Temple. This building was not only an architectural masterpiece, but also a religious and political symbol that solidified Jerusalem's role as the holy center of the Israelites. The temple was built on the Temple Mount, an elevated plateau that David had already designated for this purpose. While David had brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, he was not permitted to build the temple. This task was reserved for his son Solomon. With the help of Phoenician craftsmen, particularly from Tyre, and using precious materials such as cedar wood from Lebanon and imported gold, Solomon created a structure that demonstrated the power and wealth of the kingdom. According to tradition, the construction of the temple lasted 7 years and was inaugurated with elaborate ceremonies. Inside the temple was the Holy of Holies, a secluded room where the Ark of the Covenant containing the tablets of the Ten Commandments was kept. This room was considered the holiest place in Judaism, for here, according to the belief of the Israelites, the immediate presence of God was felt. Only the high priest was allowed to enter this room once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, to seek atonement for the people. Thus, the temple was directly linked to the religious identity and the relationship between God and Israel. But Solomon's temple was more than just a cult building. It also served as a symbol of political stability and the unity of the kingdom. Through it, Jerusalem was definitively elevated to the undisputed capital and religious center that united the 12 tribes of Israel under a common symbol. Pilgrims from all parts of the kingdom came to offer sacrifices, celebrate festivals, and participate in religious rituals. At the same time, the temple also reflected Israel's international connectivity. Solomon maintained trade relations with Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean region. In its splendor, the temple was an expression of these foreign policy contacts and the prosperity the kingdom experienced during this era. The construction of the first temple shaped the self-understanding of the Jewish people for centuries. Even after its later destruction by the Babylonians, it remained the ideal and symbol of a golden past, to which religious traditions and hopes still connect today. With Solomon's temple, Jerusalem definitively attained the holiness that made the city a unique spiritual center in all subsequent epochs. Babylonian exile. The year 586 BC marked a catastrophe that would shape the destiny of Jerusalem and the Jewish people for centuries to come. During this time, the great Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar I extended its power far across the Near East. The kingdom of Judah, to which Jerusalem belonged, was caught in these power struggles between great powers. Initially, it had been forced to submit to Babylon, but repeated revolts by Judean kings against Babylonian suzerainty eventually led to drastic consequences. Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem, and after months of resistance, the city fell in 586 BC. The Babylonians destroyed not only the city, its walls and palaces, but also the first temple, which King Solomon had built almost 4 centuries earlier. With this destruction, the Jewish people lost their religious and cultural center. The Ark of the Covenant, whose fate remains unknown to this day, disappeared from the records in this context. In addition to the physical annihilation of the city, the fate of the population was devastating. The Babylonian conquerors deported large parts of the Jewish upper class, priests, craftsmen, and scholars to Mesopotamia. This forced stay in a foreign land went down in history as the Babylonian exile. For the people, it meant not only the loss of their homeland, but also a profound religious crisis. How could one serve God when the temple was destroyed and one lived far from Jerusalem? Precisely during this time, however, new forms of faith developed that became formative for later Jewish religion. Synagogues emerged as places of prayer and instruction, as sacrifices in the destroyed temple were no longer possible. Scripture and Torah study gained greater importance, allowing Judaism to preserve its identity even in exile. The Babylonian exile was thus a profound trauma but also a turning point. It showed the vulnerability of the Jewish people, but at the same time strengthened their awareness of their own religious and cultural unity. The yearning for return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple henceforth shaped the hope of many generations, a motif that is reflected in the Psalms and prophetic words of this time. Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Jerusalem was thus not only a political act but an event that profoundly shaped the religious history of Judaism. Persian rule. With the conquest of Babylon by the Persian king Cyrus II in 539 BC, a new epoch began for Jerusalem, described in Jewish sources as a time of return and new beginnings. For the people of Israel, this was a decisive turning point because after decades of exile in Babylon, the Jews were given the opportunity to return to their ancestral homeland. Cyrus issued an edict that not only allowed the Jews to return home but also granted them permission to rebuild the destroyed temple in Jerusalem. This step is presented in the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Ezra, as an expression of divine providence. The pagan king is described there as an instrument of the God of Israel who enables the liberation of his people. However, the return did not occur in a single large movement, but in several waves that stretched over decades. Many of the Jews born in Babylon had by then integrated into society and remained there, but a significant portion returned to the land of Judah. However, they did not find a flourishing land but a destroyed city, a depopulated country, and a society characterized by poverty, insecurity, and the loss of its religious institutions. The reconstruction was a gigantic task, both materially and spiritually. The most significant expression of this return was the construction of the so-called Second Temple. Shortly after the return, under the leadership of Zerubbabel and the high priest Joshua, reconstruction began. The temple was completed and rededicated around 516 BC. Although it could not match the size and splendor of Solomon's first temple, its construction had enormous symbolic significance. It represented the renewal of the covenant with God and once again became the spiritual and religious center of Judaism. The sacrificial cult, which could no longer be practiced during the Babylonian period, now resumed its firm place in the daily life of the community. With Persian rule, the political structure of Jerusalem also changed. The city and its surroundings were integrated as a province, the satrapy of Judah, into the Persian Empire. The high priest gained increasing political importance during this time as the Persians pursued a pragmatic policy. They relied on local elites who were responsible for administration and order, while the suzerainty of the great king remained unchallenged. Thus, Jerusalem developed into a religious center where the priesthood assumed a leading role. In addition to the reconstruction of the temple, religious renewal was central. Important figures such as Ezra, a scribe, and Nehemiah, a high official in Persian service, returned to Jerusalem and contributed decisively to the reshaping of Jewish life. They introduced reforms that made the law, the Torah, the central foundation of the community. This shifted the weight of Jewish identity more strongly to the study of Scripture, the observance of religious commandments, and the cultivation of a clearly defined communal identity, developments that shaped Judaism into later times. The Persian era thus brought stability and the possibility of a new beginning. Even though the Jews remained under foreign rule and political opportunities were limited, the return to the homeland and the renewal of the temple meant a fundamental regaining of religious self-determination. Jerusalem was thus once again a holy place and a symbol of continuity, even if the city was still far from the size and importance it had once achieved under David and Solomon. Greek rule. When Alexander the Great advanced into the land of Judah in the year BC after his legendary victorious campaign against the Persian Empire, he finally reached Jerusalem. The exact details of the encounter are not unequivocally preserved historically. However, Jewish sources such as the Talmud describe that Alexander was received by the priests in a festive procession and spared the city. Whether this account is literally true or rather a later attempt to emphasize Jerusalem's importance remains open. What is clear, however, is that with Alexander's conquest, a new era began for Jerusalem and the Jewish people, its integration into the Hellenistic world. Greek rule differed significantly from the Persian period. While the Persians had granted the Jews extensive religious autonomy, the influence of Greek culture, Hellenism, brought profound changes. Alexander himself initially showed tolerance and did not pursue a policy of oppression, but he left behind a new world order, an empire that stretched from Macedonia to India, and in which the Greek language, philosophy, and way of life had a unifying effect. In Jerusalem, too, a cultural change slowly began. Trade, education, and architecture increasingly oriented themselves on the Greek model, and the Jewish population faced the challenge of choosing between preserving their own traditions and adapting to the new influences. After Alexander's early death in 323 BC, his empire disintegrated into several successor states. Jerusalem initially came under the rule of the Ptolemies, the Greek-descended rulers in Egypt. Under them, the Jews continued to enjoy relative freedom, even if the tax burden was high. Later, however, Jerusalem fell to the Seleucids, who ruled in Syria and under whose kings tensions between Jewish religion and Hellenistic politics increasingly escalated. The mere fact that Jerusalem was considered part of these great power struggles shows how much the city was at the center of imperial interests. Greek rule brought not only conflicts but also lasting cultural traces. Greek terms found their way into the Jewish language. Some Jewish elites opened themselves to the philosophy and sciences of the Hellenes, and a field of tension between tradition and modernity emerged that would shape Jewish society for a long time. It was precisely this epoch that laid the groundwork for later conflicts, which were to culminate in the Maccabean Revolt. Thus, in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, Jerusalem stood at the threshold between old religious roots and new cultural penetration. The city remained the holy center of the Jewish world, but it was now also part of a larger Greek-influenced civilization in which political power struggles and cultural currents inextricably intertwined. Maccabean Revolt. In the 2nd century BC, tensions between the Jewish population of Jerusalem and the Seleucids reached a peak. Under Antiochus Roman IV Epiphanes, one of the most powerful kings of the Seleucid Empire, the pressure to adapt to Greek culture and religion grew steadily. Antiochus went far beyond cultural influence. He forbade central Jewish customs such as observing the Sabbath or circumcision, and even had the temple in Jerusalem desecrated. The cult of Zeus was introduced there, and sacrifices considered blasphemous by Jews had to be offered. For the Jewish population, this was not only a political attack but a direct blow against their religious identity and their holiest sanctuary. Out of this threat, resistance formed, led by the priestly family of the Maccabees, also called Hasmoneans. Mattathias, a Jewish priest, rose up against religious oppression and with his sons began a revolt that rapidly developed into a popular uprising. Judas Maccabeus, one of his sons, particularly went down in history as a charismatic leader. With shrewd tactics and deep religious fervor, the rebels succeeded in inflicting sensitive defeats on the numerically superior Seleucid troops multiple times. The decisive moment came in 164 BC when the Maccabees recaptured Jerusalem and purified the temple. They removed the pagan altars and restored Jewish worship. This act became a symbol of religious self-assertion and is commemorated to this day in Judaism by the Hanukkah festival, which celebrates the rededication of the temple and the miracle of light. Thus, the Jews had not only defended their religion but also sent a political signal. They were ready to fight for their independence. The period after the uprising indeed brought a phase of relative self-determination. The Hasmonean dynasty, descended from the Maccabean family, ruled over Jerusalem and the surrounding land and created a Jewish kingdom that in some respects recalled the time of the ancient kings of Israel. However, this independence was fragile, always threatened by the surrounding great powers who did not lose sight of the area. The Maccabean revolt, however, had far-reaching significance. It showed that the religious identity of the Jews could not simply be extinguished and that Jerusalem, despite all conquests and political dependencies, was always defended as a spiritual and religious center. This tradition of resistance and faithfulness to one's own tradition was to shape the city's history many more times. Roman rule. As the Roman Empire expanded its power further east in the 1st century BC, Jerusalem was drawn into a global political power game that would shape its future for centuries. Originally, Judea under the Hasmonean dynasty had been a kind of independent kingdom that had emerged from the Maccabean revolt. But internal conflicts, rivalries between rulers, and the increasing pressure from powerful neighboring empires weakened the land. Especially the succession dispute between the brothers Aristobulus Roman II and Hyrcanus Roman II offered the Roman general Gnaeus Pompey Magnus a welcome pretext to intervene. In 63 BC, Pompey marched into Jerusalem and initially presented himself as an arbiter between the two brothers. But it soon became clear that Rome did not intend to act in the interest of the Jewish people but would assert its own claims to power. Jerusalem was besieged, and after bitter resistance, Roman troops entered the city. The fateful moment came when Pompey stormed the Temple Mount. He himself entered the Holy of Holies, that holiest area of the Jewish temple, which was exclusively reserved for the high priest once a year. Although Pompey did not plunder the temple's treasures and left the cult untouched, the Jews felt this to be an unprecedented desecration. The temple was not just a building but the center of their faith and an expression of their national identity, and a Roman general had now entered it as if he were master of their destiny. With this, Jerusalem's political independence was de facto ended. Although Hyrcanus Roman II formally remained in office, it was only as high priest and ethnarch, i.e., as a representative of the Jewish population under Roman supervision. Rome had taken control and Judea became a vassal state. This dependence was only to intensify over the years. With Herod the Great, whom Rome installed as king, the country gained a powerful and ambitious ruler. But he was considered a foreign ruler by many because he relied primarily on Roman support. Herod invested enormous sums in the development of Jerusalem. He had fortresses, palaces, and theaters built, but also extensively enlarged and beautified the Second Temple so that it became a monumental structure that aroused widespread admiration. But beneath this splendid surface, it was seething. Many Jews rejected Herod because, in their view, he did not embody religious and national purity. Instead, they saw him as a ruler who mixed their traditions with foreign influences and ultimately acted as a tool of Rome. Roman rule brought trade opportunities, roads, and a certain stability, but it also demanded high taxes and the presence of soldiers who shaped the cityscape. An opposition grew ever stronger between Jerusalem's religious significance as the city of God and the political reality of a Roman province. Especially within the Jewish population, various groups developed. The Sadducees, who tended to cooperate with Rome, the Pharisees, who wanted to preserve religious purity, and the Zealots, who preached armed resistance. Thus, in the 1st century BC and 1st century AD, Jerusalem became a focal point of contrasts. Rome with its worldly power and claim to rule the Mediterranean Empire, and a people who drew their identity from the covenant with their God and were reluctant to submit to foreign rule. This tension, which began with the conquest by Pompey, laid the groundwork for the later great conflicts, uprisings, wars, and finally the catastrophe of the temple's destruction in AD 70, time of Jesus. In the first decades of the 1st century AD, Jerusalem was not only the political and religious metropolis of the Jewish people, but also a city in which diverse currents, expectations, and conflicts converged. Under Roman rule, but with relative autonomy in religious matters, the city was characterized by the presence of the magnificent temple, which stood at the center of Jewish faith and was at the same time a symbol of collective identity. In this atmosphere, Jesus of Nazareth appeared, whose work and destiny became closely intertwined with the history of Jerusalem. For many Jews of that time, the city was considered a holy place where the closeness of God manifested itself particularly strongly. At the same time, Jerusalem was also a political powder keg. The Roman occupation, high tax burdens, and tensions between various religious currents repeatedly led to unrest. Groups such as the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Zealots vied for influence and debated how the Jewish people should deal with foreign rule. In this complex situation, Jesus appeared, preached in the streets and squares of the city, met with approval but also fierce rejection. His arrival in Jerusalem, often celebrated as an entry, marked the beginning of the last dramatic phase of his life. Tradition reports of his confrontation with the temple merchants, of his sermons on neighborly love and humility, and of the growing concern of the religious and political elites who saw his message as a danger to the existing order. The Passion story, which finally culminated in the crucifixion of Jesus on Golgotha, made Jerusalem the scene of an event that gained world historical significance for emerging Christianity. The reports of the resurrection, which are inextricably linked with Jerusalem, lend the city an even deeper symbolic dimension. For early Christians, it became not only a place of remembrance of Jesus' suffering and death, but also the embodiment of hope, redemption, and the beginning of a new community of faith. Thus, Jerusalem acquired a universal radiance that extended far beyond Judaism and made it one of the central places of Christianity. Destruction of the Temple. In the year AD, one of the most dramatic turning points in Jewish history reached its climax: the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The background was a long-standing and increasingly escalating conflict between the Jewish population of Judea and the Roman occupying power. Decades earlier, dissatisfaction with Roman rule had steadily grown due to high taxes, religious tensions, and the feeling that Jewish identity was being suppressed and disregarded. Especially the Zealots, a radical group, openly called for armed resistance. Finally, in AD 66, the so-called First Jewish War broke out when Jewish rebels attacked Roman garrisons and took control of Jerusalem. Rome could not tolerate this affront. Emperor Nero initially dispatched the general Vespasian. Later, his son Titus took command. With massive legions, the Romans advanced against Judea, conquering city after city, and finally marched on Jerusalem, which was defended by various Jewish factions deeply at odds with each other. The siege of Jerusalem began in the spring of AD and lasted several months. Titus had massive siege engines brought in and a wall built around the city to cut off all supplies. Inside the walls, hunger, disease, and despair reigned, and the bitter internal struggles of the defenders further weakened the city. When the Romans finally breached the outer defenses, terrible scenes ensued. The resistance was desperate, but the superior power of the Roman legions was overwhelming. The temple area in particular became the scene of the last and fiercest fighting. The Second Temple, which Herod the Great had once splendidly expanded and beautified, was considered the heart of Jewish faith and a visible expression of the people's special connection to their God. But in the chaos of the conquest, it was set ablaze by the Romans. Despite alleged orders from Titus to spare the sanctuary, the flames raged until the entire structure lay in rubble and ashes. The destruction of the temple was an immeasurable shock for the Jewish world. Not only was a building lost, but the central symbol of religious identity and national unity. With it, the traditional sacrificial cult system, which had shaped religious life for centuries, also ended. At the same time, the fall of Jerusalem marked a decisive victory for Rome. Jewish resistance was largely broken. Hundreds of thousands were killed or enslaved, and large parts of the city lay in ruins. For Rome, the triumph was so significant that it was celebrated throughout the empire. In Rome itself, Titus later had the famous Arch of Titus erected, depicting the spoils of the temple, the menorah, the showbread table, and other sacred objects. For the Jews, however, a time of reorientation began. The temple was lost, and religious life had to reorganize itself. From this transitional phase, Rabbinic Judaism increasingly developed, no longer dependent on sacrifices in the temple but on the study of the Torah and prayer. The destruction of the Second Temple in AD remained a trauma in the collective memory of the Jewish people forever. To this day, Jews worldwide commemorate this loss on the 9th of Av, a fast day. Jerusalem, however, was to remain a center of longing, conflict, and faith in the centuries to come. A city whose history was irrevocably shaped by this act of Roman destruction. Hadrian's ban. After the catastrophe of the temple's destruction, the Jewish world was deeply shaken. Yet resistance against foreign Roman rule did not cease. Many Jews continued to harbor hopes for a national and religious rebirth in Jerusalem. This longing led to a final great uprising in the 2nd century AD, which would go down in history as the Bar Kokhba Revolt. Between 132 and 135 AD, the Jews, under the leadership of Simon Bar Kokhba, whom some even regarded as the awaited Messiah, rose against the Roman occupying power. The reasons for the outbreak included Roman plans to erect a temple to Jupiter on the site of the destroyed temple, and to refound Jerusalem as a Roman colony named Aelia Capitolina. For the Jewish population, this was an unbearable affront, as it threatened to definitively extinguish the religious and cultural identity of their holy city. The uprising was initially astonishingly successful. Bar Kokhba and his followers were able to reclaim parts of Judea from the Romans, establish a provisional administration, and even mint their own coins, which symbolized their short-lived independence. However, the Roman response was not long in coming. Emperor Hadrian dispatched massive troops under the leadership of experienced generals, who proceeded with brutal severity against the insurgents. The battles were bitter and lasted several years. Finally, the Romans succeeded in encircling the rebels in a series of fortresses and systematically eliminating them. In 135 AD, the last stronghold of the rebels fell in Badr, and with it, the hope for an independent Jewish commonwealth in Palestine shattered. Roman retaliation was relentless. Hundreds of thousands of Jews lost their lives. Many more were sold into slavery or dispersed across the empire. But the harshest and most symbolic punishment was Hadrian's decision to completely forbid Jews from entering their holy city of Jerusalem. In place of Jerusalem, the Roman colony of Aelia Capitolina was officially established, named after Hadrian's family name Aelius and the Capitoline Temple in Rome. A sanctuary for Jupiter was erected on the Temple Mount, and the city's streets were laid out according to Roman design. For the Jews, this ban meant a profound rupture. Jerusalem, which for centuries had been the heart of their religious and cultural life, was completely taken away from them. Only once a year, on the fast day commemorating the temple's destruction, were Jews reportedly allowed to glimpse the city from outside. A humiliating reminder of the loss. The dream of Jerusalem as the center of Jewish life transformed into a longing that remained alive in prayers, songs, and texts. Throughout the diaspora, Jews began to pray facing Jerusalem, and the awareness that they would one day return there became a core of their identity. Hadrian's ban and the establishment of Aelia Capitolina therefore marked not only the end of political independence, but also the beginning of a long epoch of the Jewish diaspora, in which the people had to live without their holy city. For the Romans, it was a means to finally break Jewish resistance. For the Jews, however, it became the starting point of an unshakable hope that, despite all defeats, never quite died out. Byzantine period, With the division of the Roman Empire and Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity, a completely new era began for Jerusalem. Until then, the city had existed primarily as Aelia Capitolina, a Roman colony and military base, largely detached from its former Jewish and religious significance. But in the 4th century, its fate changed dramatically. Under Constantine the Great, Christianity transformed from a persecuted religion to a state-recognized and eventually dominant faith of the empire. Thus, Jerusalem once again moved to the center of world history. Now, however, no longer as a Jewish but as a Christian holy city. Especially the journey of Empress Helena, Constantine's mother, to Jerusalem around 326 AD is considered a decisive moment. According to tradition, she purposefully sought out places associated with the life, suffering, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In this context, she is said to have identified the spot where Jesus' cross, the true cross, was found. On these holy sites, Constantine ordered the construction of a monumental church, later known as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It was consecrated in 335 and quickly developed into the most important pilgrimage destination for Christendom. Jerusalem, which had previously been a provincial town for Jews and Romans, now became the spiritual center of a New World religion. In the following centuries, the city experienced extensive Christian influence. Numerous churches, monasteries, and pilgrim accommodations were built to accommodate the steadily growing influx of believers from all parts of the empire. Places associated with biblical narratives now received monumental structures. The Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, the Church on the Mount of Olives, or the Basilica on the site of the Last Supper. At the same time, the Roman character of Jerusalem was not eradicated but rather transformed into Christian symbolism. Streets, squares, and buildings acquired new meaning in the light of Christian salvation history. But the Byzantine period was not only a phase of religious flourishing, but also one marked by tensions and conflicts. The Jewish population remained largely excluded from Jerusalem, and the city was now clearly oriented towards Christian life. Even within Christianity itself, disputes arose, for example, between the different theological directions that were discussed in the great councils of this era. Jerusalem became a venue for debates about the correct interpretation of faith, and at the same time a focal point of political rivalries in the Eastern Mediterranean. In addition, there was the external threat. In the 7th century, the Persian Sassanids began to expand their influence, and in 614 they actually succeeded in capturing Jerusalem. Churches were destroyed, relics carried off, including allegedly the true cross. Only through the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius could the city be reconquered, and the cross was solemnly brought back to Jerusalem in a procession. But the weakness of the Byzantine Empire had become unmistakable. Only a few decades later, the Muslim Arabs under Caliph Umar would finally conquer the city and transfer it into a new phase of history. The Byzantine period thus marks the moment when Jerusalem gained its Christian identity. From a Roman colony, it became the holy city of Christendom, a destination for pilgrims, a place of monumental church buildings and religious veneration. At the same time, however, this epoch was overshadowed by political instability and religious conflicts. A premonition that Jerusalem would remain a place of longing, faith, and disputes in the centuries to come. Islamic conquest. When Muslim armies stormed out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, the political map of the Near East fundamentally changed, and with it the fate of Jerusalem. The city, which until then had belonged to the Byzantine Empire and was deeply rooted in Christian tradition, suddenly became the center of a new rising power. In 638, Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second successor to the Prophet Muhammad, entered the city. The transition, in contrast to many other conquests of the time, proceeded surprisingly peacefully. While Byzantine rule had been characterized by high taxes, military pressure, and internal tensions, many inhabitants initially found a more tolerant alternative in the Muslim conquerors. The Islamic takeover brought a profound reorientation of Jerusalem's religious and cultural landscape. For Muslims, the city was a holy place from the outset. In traditions, it is considered the place from which the Prophet Muhammad is said to have ascended to heaven during his night journey. This event gave Jerusalem a central role in the Islamic world of faith, as the third holiest city of Islam after Mecca and Medina. Caliph Umar himself is said to have acted with respect towards the Christian inhabitants after the city's surrender. According to reports, he refused to pray in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to prevent Muslims from claiming this church as a mosque later. Instead, he prayed in an open space nearby, a place that later became the foundation for the construction of significant Islamic sanctuaries. In the decades following the conquest, Jerusalem experienced a flourishing of Islamic architecture. The most significant step was the construction of the Dome of the Rock, Qubat as-Sakra, in 691 under Caliph Abd al-Malik. This magnificent structure with its golden dome visible from afar was built directly on the Temple Mount, the site of the former Jewish sanctuary. The Dome of the Rock was not only an architectural masterpiece but also a political symbol. It was intended to firmly anchor the presence and claim of Islam in the city. A little later, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was also built, which is also one of the most important sanctuaries of Islam. Thus, the Temple Mount, which had stood at the center of Jewish faith for centuries, gained a new religious significance. For Christians, Islamic rule meant the loss of their political dominance, but the city remained an important pilgrimage destination. Christians and Jews, as people of the book in Islam, received the status of dhimmis. This meant they were allowed to practice their religion but had to pay special taxes and accept certain restrictions. This arrangement guaranteed a certain stability, even if there were always phases of tension and disadvantage. Compared to the bloody conflicts of later centuries, the first Islamic phase was characterized by a certain degree of tolerance and coexistence. Jerusalem thus transformed within a few decades from a Byzantine Christian city to a center of Islam. The golden dome of the Rock henceforth shaped the cityscape and became a new symbol for Jerusalem's spiritual significance. At the same time, the city remained holy for Christians and Jews, a circumstance that would shape Jerusalem's complex multiple identity in the centuries to come. Under Muslim rule, an era began in which the city not only attracted pilgrims from all parts of the Islamic world, but also became a hub of political, religious, and cultural power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Crusader period. When Pope Urban Roman II called for the First Crusade in Clermont in 1095, one of the great goals was the reconquest of Jerusalem, which was considered of inestimable importance to Christians as the place of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. 4 years later, in 1099, after an arduous march through Anatolia and Syria, the Crusaders finally reached the walls of Jerusalem. After a bloody siege during which hunger, disease, and exhaustion afflicted both defenders and attackers, the Christian knights stormed the city on July 15. What followed was a massacre that resonates in collective memory to this day. Contemporary chroniclers report that the streets were flooded with blood as Muslims and Jews were slaughtered. For the Crusaders, however, it was the fulfillment of their sacred goal. The city of God was in Christian hands. Jerusalem was subsequently elevated to the center of a new kingdom, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Norman nobleman Godfrey of Bouillon took the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre, as he refused to wear a royal crown in the city sacred to Christ. His brother Baldwin soon succeeded him as the first official king of Jerusalem. The kingdom became a crusader state with a feudal structure that stretched across parts of Palestine and Syria. The Crusaders began to reshape the city. Churches were built or expanded, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which served as a spiritual center. Numerous European orders such as the Templars and Hospitallers settled to protect pilgrims and secure Christian influence. However, Christian Jerusalem remained a fragile entity. It was constantly surrounded by Muslim empires, and the Crusaders were numerically significantly outnumbered in the region. To secure their kingdom, they had to rely on pilgrim flows and reinforcements from Europe, which brought the city into permanent dependence on the West. Jerusalem's Muslim population experienced harsh restrictions. Many were expelled or lived as subjects with limited rights. Jews were almost completely excluded from the city in the first decades. Despite these tensions, Jerusalem developed into an international magnet in the 12th century. Pilgrims from all over Europe flocked to the city to visit the holy sites. Crusader rule also brought a mixture of cultures. Latin, Byzantine, Armenian, and Oriental influences shaped architecture, administration, and daily life. Nevertheless, the kingdom was torn apart from the outset by internal power struggles, weak kings, and constant military threats. The greatest danger grew with the rise of Muslim rulers like Nur ad-Din and finally Salah ad-Din, known in the West as Saladin. This charismatic and strategically brilliant sultan united the Muslim forces in Syria and Egypt and led a successful jihad against the Crusader states. After his decisive victory over the Crusaders in the Battle of Hattin in 1187, the path to Jerusalem was clear. In October of the same year, the city capitulated after negotiations. In contrast to 1099, Saladin spared most of the Christian population and granted them the opportunity to leave the city or stay for ransom. Thus, Crusader rule over Jerusalem ended after less than 90 years. The city was once again under Muslim control, but the memory of the Crusader period continued to shape Europe for a long time. It was glorified as a heroic struggle for the Holy Land, while for Muslims it was proof of their steadfastness against the invaders. Jerusalem had once again proven its role as a contested religious symbol and would do so repeatedly in the centuries to come. Saladin conquers Jerusalem. When Saladin marched on Jerusalem in the year 1187, after his triumphant victory against the Crusaders in the Battle of Hattin, the city was exhausted and demoralized. The defeat at Hattin had not only annihilated the military strength of the Crusaders, but also brought their greatest sanctuary, the True Cross, into Saladin's hands. For the Crusaders, this was a devastating loss. For the Muslims, however, a strong symbol of divine confirmation of their struggle. The path to Jerusalem was now largely undefended, and Saladin used this opportunity with shrewd strategy. When his armies reached the city, the defense was weak. The then commander Balian of Ibelin actually had no order to hold the city, but in view of the impending catastrophe, he took on the responsibility. With great effort, he organized the defense and gathered remaining knights, citizens, and clerics around him. Despite all efforts, it was clear that the city could not withstand a siege for long. Supplies were scarce, the walls damaged, and there was little prospect of reinforcements from Europe or other Crusader states. Saladin, in turn, proved to be both a skilled warrior and a prudent statesman. He knew that the conquest of Jerusalem would not only be a military victory, but also a political and religious symbol of the highest importance. In contrast to the Crusaders of 1099, who had caused a massacre when storming the city, Saladin decided to proceed with moderation. After tough but fair negotiations, the city surrendered in October 1187. The conditions were clear. Christians who wanted to stay had to pay a ransom. Those who could not afford it were often bought free by Muslim benefactors. Many were also given free passage to Tyre or other Crusader cities. The Muslims, on the other hand, celebrated the return of Jerusalem to Islamic hands. Especially the reconquest of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque was seen as a sacred restoration, as these sites had been converted into churches or warehouses under Christian rule. Saladin had the buildings cleaned and returned to Islamic worship. For the Jewish population, his conquest even brought an improvement. While the Crusaders had largely excluded them, Saladin allowed the Jews to return and re-establish a community in Jerusalem. The reconquest of Jerusalem by Saladin had far-reaching consequences. In Europe, the news caused shock and indignation. Pope Gregory Roman VIII immediately called for the Third Crusade, and soon rulers like Richard the Lionheart, Philip Roman II of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa set off for the Holy Land. Although this crusade brought some successes, Jerusalem remained under Muslim rule, except for brief diplomatic interim periods. For the Muslim world, Saladin became a legend. He embodied not only the successful fighter, but also the just ruler who treated his enemies honorably and proved merciful, in contrast to the atrocities of 1099. Jerusalem itself now experienced a phase of stabilization in which Islamic institutions and endowments were strengthened. At the same time, the city remained at the center of conflicts between Christianity and Islam, a symbol of faith that both religions claimed for themselves. Ottoman period. When the Ottomans under Sultan Selim I defeated the Mamluk Empire in 1517 and brought Palestine under their control, a new era began for Jerusalem that would last for 4 centuries. With its incorporation into the Ottoman Empire, the city was now part of one of the largest empires in the world, stretching from Eastern Europe deep into North Africa. Jerusalem lost its role as a political center, as the empire's capital was in Constantinople, but its importance as a religious metropolis for Jews, Christians, and Muslims remained unbroken. Under Ottoman rule, the city was administered as a holy place, and its status as a pilgrimage destination gained even more weight. The reign of Sultan Sulayman the Magnificent was particularly formative for the cityscape. He recognized Jerusalem's symbolic and religious significance and invested considerable resources in the city's expansion and beautification. Under his rule, the city walls were completely renewed, those massive walls that still enclose and shape large parts of the old city today. These walls not only provided Jerusalem with protection, but also with a representative face that underscored its importance for the Ottoman Empire. Religious buildings and endowments were also generously supported. Mosques, schools, fountains, and hospices were built, significantly improving life in the city. For Muslims, Jerusalem remained a place of central religious importance as it housed the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, 2 of the holiest sites in Islam. But Christians and Jews also found comparatively stable conditions during this epoch. The Ottomans practiced the so-called millet system, which granted the various religious communities a certain autonomy in religious and legal matters. Thus, Christians could maintain and expand their churches, and Jews were also able to develop their communities more strongly again. Pilgrimages to Jerusalem experienced a boom during this time as the relative security and stability of the Ottoman Empire made travel easier and safer. Despite this religious flourishing, daily life in Jerusalem was often marked by poverty. The city was not an economic metropolis. It had no significant industry and was somewhat off the main trade routes of the empire. Many inhabitants lived from pilgrims, religious endowments, or small crafts. At the same time, conflicts between the different faiths occurred repeatedly throughout the centuries, especially within Christianity, where Catholic, Orthodox, and Oriental churches vied for control of holy sites. These rivalries were often taken to Constantinople, where the Sultan, as supreme arbiter, made decisions. In the 19th century, Jerusalem increasingly became the focus of European powers. With the growing interest of Western states in the Near East and the weakening of the Ottoman Empire due to internal crises, powers such as Great Britain, France, and Russia began to establish diplomatic representations, churches, and schools in Jerusalem. At the same time, Jewish interest in the city also grew, intensified by the first stirrings of the Zionist movement towards the end of the century. This marked the beginning of a phase in which Jerusalem became not only a holy place, but also a center of geopolitical tensions. When the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed in World War I, Jerusalem's era as an Ottoman province also ended. In 1917, British troops under General Edmund Allenby captured the city, and Jerusalem entered a completely new phase, that of the British Mandate. But the Ottoman traces remained visible. The walls built by Sultan Sulayman stand to this day and shape the image of the Old City, a symbol of a long epoch in which Jerusalem was an integral part of a great Islamic power and yet preserved its special status as a holy city for three religions. British Mandate. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed in World War I, a completely new chapter opened in Jerusalem's history. In December 1917, British troops under General Edmund Allenby marched into the city. The conquest had deliberately occurred without heavy destruction, as the British wanted to respect Jerusalem's holy significance and symbolically demonstrate that they had come as liberators, not destroyers. With the entry, more than 400 years of Ottoman rule ended, and Jerusalem was now integrated into the British Mandate of Palestine, officially confirmed by the League of Nations. The British administration faced a difficult task. Jerusalem was not only a city of enormous religious significance, but also a melting pot of different interests, which were now exacerbated by international politics. Throughout the war, Great Britain had made contradictory promises, on the one hand to the Arabs, who had hoped for support in the fight against the Ottomans and aspired to an independent Arab nation. On the other hand, to the Jews, who were offered the establishment of a national home in Palestine with the Balfour Declaration of 1917. This dual promise inevitably led to tensions that also erupted in Jerusalem. In the 1920s and 30s, clashes between the Jewish and Arab inhabitants of the city increasingly occurred. The influx of Jewish immigrants from Europe grew strongly, exacerbated by rising anti-Semitism and later by Nazi persecutions. While Jewish communities expanded their infrastructure, schools, and neighborhoods, Arab Palestinians increasingly felt marginalized and feared for their political and economic future. Bloody confrontations repeatedly broke out, for example, during the riots of 1929, which were sparked by disputes over the Western Wall. The British Mandate administration tried to find a balance but increasingly failed due to conflicting interests. They appointed commissions of inquiry, imposed immigration restrictions on Jews, and tried to appease Arab resistance through political concessions. But neither the Jewish nor the Arab side was satisfied. For the Jews, immigration restrictions, especially in the 1930s when persecution escalated in Europe, were a catastrophe. For the Arabs, in turn, continuous Jewish immigration, despite all restrictions, was a permanent trigger for protests and uprisings. At the same time, Jerusalem increasingly became a diplomatic and religious focal point for the international community during this period. Western powers closely monitored developments, and religious institutions, whether Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, strengthened their presence. Churches, schools, and missions expanded, and the city also developed architecturally. New neighborhoods emerged outside the old city. Modern administrative buildings, roads, and infrastructures changed Jerusalem's face. World War II brought tensions to a new level. The Holocaust marked a terrible climax in the Jewish tragedy, and the demand for a secure Jewish homeland gained immense urgency. The Arab population of Palestine, however, intensified its resistance against a possible partition of the country and against the growing Jewish presence. After the war, the situation became uncontrollable for the British. Terrorist attacks by Jewish underground organizations, Arab uprisings, and international pressure eventually led Great Britain to return the mandate to the United Nations. With the end of the British Mandate in 1948 and the subsequent establishment of the State of Israel, Jerusalem entered its next dramatic phase. The city was divided in the war between Israelis and Arabs, a fate that would again shape its history for decades. But the British Mandate period remains a key moment to this day because it laid the foundations for many conflict lines that persist into the present. Division. With the establishment of the State of Israel in May and the ensuing Arab-Israeli War, a new, highly dramatic era began for Jerusalem. The city, for millennia a symbol of religious longing and political power, was now literally cut in two. While Jewish militias initially tried to hold the Old City and the holy sites, the Arab legions from Transjordan, led by King Abdullah, succeeded in capturing East Jerusalem, including the Old City, during the fighting. The Jewish population, who had lived there for centuries in cramped quarters, was expelled, synagogues were destroyed or repurposed, and access to the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, remained denied to Jews for the next 19 years. West Jerusalem, on the other hand, became part of the newly founded State of Israel. There, the young government established not only its most important institutions but also cultural and economic centers. Although Tel Aviv was initially the internationally recognized capital, West Jerusalem factually developed into Israel's political heart. Government buildings, the Knesset, universities, and museums were built, and the city grew rapidly due to the influx of Jewish refugees from Arab countries as well as Holocaust survivors. East Jerusalem remained under Jordanian administration. King Abdullah had the area closely integrated into his kingdom, and for Muslims, the city remained an important religious center as it housed the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, two of the most significant sanctuaries of Islam. Christians could continue to visit their holy sites, especially the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but for Jews, East Jerusalem remained taboo. This separation, which was made visible in parts by barbed wire and fortified barriers running through the middle of the city, deeply affected the lives of the inhabitants. Families were torn apart, trade routes blocked, and the old city, once a melting pot, was now the scene of a harsh, dividing line between two political worlds. The international community reacted ambivalently to the situation. The United Nations had originally intended to place Jerusalem under international administration to protect its special significance for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. But the 1948 war had thwarted these plans, and the divided city was a reality that no one could truly undo. Thus, Jerusalem remained between 1948 and 1967, a symbol of unresolved political and religious tensions in the Middle East. Despite the physical division, West Jerusalem developed dynamically during this period, while East Jerusalem comparatively stagnated. The Israeli side invested in infrastructure, education, and cultural life, while the Jordanian side remained rather conservative and pursued no major modernization projects. But the deep longing of many Jews to one day regain access to the Western Wall and the Old City remained a strong emotional driving force that shaped Israel's self-understanding. When the Six-Day War broke out in 1967, this picture was to change radically, and Jerusalem once again became the center of global political upheaval. Six-Day War. In June 1967, one of the most decisive wars in the Middle East broke out, the Six-Day War. The triggers were increasing tensions between Israel and its Arab neighbors Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Blockades, troop movements, and aggressive rhetoric created an explosive situation. Israel, threatened by encirclement, decided on a preemptive strike. Within a few days, the country achieved an overwhelming military victory. It occupied the Sinai, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and conquered East Jerusalem, which had been under Jordanian control since 1948. The battles for Jerusalem were short but fierce. The area around the Old City in particular was heavily contested. Israeli paratroopers stormed in through the Lion's Gate and captured the heart of the city. On June 7, 1967, the historic words echoed over the radio, "The Temple Mount is in our hands." For many Israelis, this was a moment of deep religious and national significance. For the first time in almost 2,000 years, Jews stood sovereign again at the site of the Second Temple, at the Western Wall, which was now no longer inaccessible. But the euphoria on the Israeli side stood in sharp contrast to the consequences for the Arab population of East Jerusalem. Many Palestinians lost their homes, areas were expropriated, and the city was henceforth administered by Israel. Although the residents initially received a special status, their political future remained unresolved, and to this day this status is one of the biggest points of contention in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Politically, Israel made a far-reaching decision. Just weeks after the war, the government declared that all of Jerusalem, west and east, was the eternal and undivided capital of Israel. They immediately began to unite the city, merge administrative structures, and build new residential areas in East Jerusalem to strengthen the Jewish presence. However, this annexation was not recognized by the international community. The United Nations and most states still consider East Jerusalem to be occupied territory, and to this day most countries maintain their embassies in Tel Aviv. The religious dimension of the conquest was equally significant. While Israel now controlled the Jewish holy sites, the government decided that the Islamic holy sites, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, should remain under Jordanian administration. This was intended to prevent an escalation with the Muslim world. Nevertheless, the situation remained tense as Jerusalem holds central importance for Jews, Christians, and Muslims simultaneously, and any change to the status quo created deep distrust. To this day, the outcome of the Six-Day War remains an open wound in international politics. For Israel, it symbolizes the return to its eternal roots in Jerusalem. For the Palestinians, however, it marks the beginning of an occupation that profoundly shapes their lives, their rights, and their national identity. Thus, Jerusalem remains to this day at the center of a conflict that extends far beyond the city limits, and perhaps nowhere more clearly demonstrates how history, religion, and politics are inextricably intertwined.